So this is a video lecture on Chapter 7, Memory Part 2, and it is all audio. So you will not get to see my lovely face, but you will hear my lovely voice. Okay, so we're going to continue working on Chapter 7, and now we're going to talk more about encoding, storage, and retrieval in terms of memory. So let's talk about these factors that help to influence how our brain encodes and allows us to remember things. When we're speaking about emotional arousal, it enhances memory encoding. Extreme panic interferes with memory, but moderate emotion provides benefits. This is largely by increasing the release of the hormones cortisol, as well as epinephrine or adrenaline, and again, that's coming from the adrenal gland. So those hormones will stimulate brain areas that'll help to enhance memory storage. Additionally, when we're speaking about attention and memory, many other factors would influence how well you store your memories. When we're talking about the primacy effect, this is the tendency to be able to remember well the first items. In terms of the recency effect, now that's a tendency that'll help to remember those final items. So we use the primacy and recency effects, and they're robust for almost all and any type of memory. When we're thinking about a list of mostly similar items, the unusual ones are going to be easy to remember. We'll also tend to try to remember unusual people. There might be something that strikes you that allows you to recall a person, that being if they had a tattoo or a scar, or I know I've met a person who I recall them easily because they had two different eye colors. People find it easier to remember words as well. So they might learn them earlier in childhood, like apple, orange, as well as banana. And they'll learn those, those words that they've learned later. So when people see an unexpected sex-related word, now this grabs attention so strongly that they pay less attention to the next word, which sometimes is up to the next 4 or 5 words because they got stuck on that sexually related word. Other things being equal, though, you would probably remember a list of people or animals better than a list of inanimate objects, even if they're familiar objects like a stove or a hat. People and animals, they'll grab your attention and interest more than most anything else would. So, according to the depth of processing principle, how easily you retrieve a memory really depends on the number and types of associations you can formulate. When you read a list, or you might read the chapter on memory, simply reading the words without much thought, that's really considered to be shallow processing, and it's only going to produce fleeting type of memories. On the other hand, you might stop and consider various points as you read them, relate them to your own experiences, and then you'll start to think of your own examples to be able to illustrate each principle. The more ways you think about the material, the deeper your processing will be, and the more easily you'll start to remember it later on. So, when you form a memory, you link it in a way that you thought about it at that time. When you try to recall a memory, it's going to be a cue that's going to be the most effective, as if it resembles the links that you formed at the time of the storage. So retrieval cues are those simple little reminders that we'll put into place to help us to remember and recall the entire picture. When we're speaking about encoding specificity principle, again, it's about that idea of how we associate and formulate at the time that we learn something. And that's going to be the most effective way that we'll retrieve those cues later on. Now, How to organize your studying. You know, I always want to make sure that you have the best ways and forms to be able to study, be able to take in, absorb, learn, and then finally recall and remember. So if you're spreading your study out more, it's going to be more effective than if you study in a single session. When it's a single session, you kind of underestimate how much you'll forget later. So you don't practice retrieving a memory because basically it's still fresh. In terms of long-term memory, it's best if you study under varying conditions. So spreading out examples is better than studying many examples at the same time. Suppose you're trying to learn the artistic styles of several painters so that you can identify new paintings by the same artist. Would you learn better by seeing many paintings by of one artist and then many by the second artist, or the third, or the fourth, or we can keep going? Or would it be better for you to, see one each at a time and then another in their own work separately each at a time and keep going that way? Most of the people, they're going to assume the first way is a better way, seeing them all at given one time. However, results have been able to show that spacing it out works much better than trying to bunch it all together. Students will seldom get much training on how to take notes. We expect you to just do that. Extremely brief notes, they'll do you very little good. But trying to record every word, that can be problematic as well. Okay? So what you want to try to do is record everything. You know, trying to record everything, it's going to be tiring. And if you do succeed, your notes will be so long that you're going to be intimidated when it's time to review them later. So the best kind of strategy is actually to try to record the main ideas of in an organized fashion. So when I say that, when you're taking notes, I know there's times they'll go, Dr. Kearns-Cooper, can you repeat what you said? What you want to do is when I give you a statement, what's the most important part of that statement? Would it be me saying he or she? Or is the content of talking about, for example, she'll remember words more effectively if she break it down into parts? What's going to be the part that allows you to remember the breaking into parts? So you don't have to put in the filler words of he or she, but remembering is more effective breaking into parts. So when you chunk that, y'all remember chunking, you now allowed yourself an opportunity to be able to pick up on that content a lot faster than trying to write every word that I would say, and thus you really still miss the point because it's not, you're not getting the main picture of when you're studying. Now, alternating between reading and testing, this helps to enhance long-term memory better than if you just spent time just reading. When you're talking about testing, you remember when I give you exams, what do? I give you a practice test first. And not that you get the exact same questions, but you get the overall idea of the content. This allows, if you're reading, allows yourself to help to recall and review the information and whether or not you're actually gathered it. And if you're still struggling, it allows you an opportunity to reread as well as test yourself and ask yourself those questions that you might have missed when you took the practice test. So a test forces you to be able to generate that material instead of passively looking it over. So yes, there's a method to my madness on why I give practice tests. Also, it shows you what you don't know. Hopefully it's helping to encourage you to pay more attention to that material in the text, or to study it in a different way if you're not picking it up. So those are just a few ways that you can help yourself in terms of how to be able to recall the information together. Because, you know, when you're taking 5 to 6 classes, that's a lot that you're taking in when you're working on a 15-week semester. And the expectation is that you're going to be able to recall it. When you do effective note taking, when you spread out and read in sections, not try to put it all in one chunk and think you're going to remember, but when you space it out, you tend to get to understand and recall it better. Now, mnemonic devices. This is where it's a memory aid that's going to be based on encoding items in a particularly special way. One mnemonic device might be to think of an image that will help you remind you of what you need to remember. So let's make an example for this. If you wanted to remember the functions of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, you might think of a symphony of the sympathetic nervous system and a parachute for the parasympathetic nervous system. If the symphony excites you, it arouses your sympathetic nervous system. The parachute might let you coast down slowly. Therefore, like a parasympathetic nervous system, it's going to help to calm. Get the picture? Well, mnemonic devices, it can be helpful for remembering people's names too. So, for example, you might remember someone named Harry Moore by picturing him as More Harry, but you don't want to say that out loud to them. That's for you to use to remember their names. There's so many different type of ways of creating a mnemonic device. Just remember, again, it's an aid to help in coding for you to be able to recall something. So looking at the slide, one more example, taking the term word bristle as a wedding vow. Better for worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish. So come up with different ways of being able to squeeze that material in and giving yourself a way to retrieve it through cues. Mnemonic devices will help you with those retrieval cues as well. Now, storage. Many moons ago, psychologists, they've imagined consolidating as a chemical process that took a fixed amount of time. However, with some memories, consolidation was much more easier than others. So when you hear Jakarta is the capital of Indonesia, you might have to work at it, to form a lasting memory. If someone says, yes, I will go with you to the dance on Friday, you store that memory almost immediately. So why do you think that happens? Well, you could try a couple of ways to enhance consolidation after learning something. One would be to take some caffeine shortly after learning something. There has been a study that actually found 200 to 300 milligrams of caffeine, and that's just about a little bit more that you would get from 8 ounces of coffee, would enhance the detail of people's memories when tested the next day. Another strategy might be, and I think I mentioned this before, sleeping or resting quietly shortly after learning. Yeah, it's kind of paradoxical in that it neither is increasing arousal or decreasing arousal to enhance consolidation, but results are you do take in and learn. If you allow yourself to study, say you study from 8 to 10 p.m., wait till at least 11 p.m. to go to sleep. You don't want to go right to sleep on it, but allow yourself to go ahead and relax, get yourself in the mode to get ready for bed, then go to sleep. Those last 2 hours that you had is actually going to get placed into storage. Because remember, our brains work on throughout what we've experienced in a day. And it tries its best to take it in and filter it during that time. All right. So people sometimes imagine that memory is like playing back a recording of an event. However, memory is unlike a recording. So suppose you try to list all the cities you have ever visited. You describe all you can and then you come back a day or two later and try again. On the second try, you probably record more than you did the first time. You recall most of, or most or all of what you said the first time, but in the meantime, something may have reminded you of something you left out the first time around. Another difference between memory and a recording would be that focusing on one part of a memory would weaken the rest of it, at least temporarily. So suppose someone asks you to describe a particular part of an experience. Perhaps, tell me about the meals you had on your beach trip, or tell me about the meals you had before coming to class. Then someone else might ask you to describe that trip in general. Answering the first question actually strengthens your memory of the meals, but it'll weaken your memory of everything else that was about the trip or about the experience before class. Now, a third, and this one is really important, okay? The difference between memory and a recording would be that when you try to remember an experience, you start with the details you remember clearly, and then you start to fill in the gaps. This is what we call reconstruction. So during a particular experience, you'll construct a memory, okay? And when you try to retrieve that memory, you'll reconstruct an account based partly on distinct memories and partly on expectations of what you felt should have had happened. Suppose you try to recall studying in the library last week. Well, with a little effort, you might remember where you sat, what you were reading, who you sat next to, and where you went to eat afterwards. If you aren't quite sure, then you'll try to start filling in gaps with what usually happens during an evening at the library. After a few weeks, you'll start to gradually forget that evening altogether. And if you try to remember it, you'll rely more and more on what must have happened, shoulda, coulda, would have happened, omitting out more and more details as it goes. So while learning the individual words in a list, people also learn the gist of what they're all about. When they try to retrieve the list later, what happens is they'll reconstruct the memory of what must have been on the list. So there have been studies that we've done in terms of showing how uh, uh, given with colors and putting the words, and then we'll talk about something familiar within that. We might give you a list, have a discussion, and then say, okay, come back and give us everything that's on the list. For example, we had you read a list of fruit. Now, originally, this list of fruit would have been apples, pears, oranges, grapes. However, then we break away from that. We have a conversation. Then I'm going to say to you, can you recall the 5 different fruits that I gave you? Most times people will come up with 3 to 4 and then add a new fruit altogether like a banana. So that's what happens with inference as well as reconstruction. Now, suppose you listen to a story about a teenager's day, and this is including both normal events, like they were watching television, and then oddities, like they parked a bicycle in the kitchen. Which one do you think you'll remember more? The normal events or the oddities? Well, basically it depends. If you're tested immediately while your memory is really strong, you're going to remember the unusual and distinctive events better. However, as you start forgetting the story, you begin to omit uh, those unlikely events. You'll forget about the bike and you'll start reconstructing a more typical day for the teenager that's including some of the story that was omitted. Basically, the less certain your memory is, the more you'll rely on your expectations. If you retell something repeatedly, either a story that you heard or an event from your own experience, the retelling gradually become more coherent. So they'll start to make more sense because you relied more on that gist, keeping the details that fit the overall theme while omitting and modifying the others. Hindsight bias. This is a good one because we all experience this. People often revise their memories, saying that how an event turned out was what they expected all along. You know, whereas you might have been asked a question, and once you heard the correct answer, you was like, that's what I was thinking about. It was on my mind. That's what I wanted to say. That's what we call hindsight bias. It's it's where the behavior is illustrating uh, this bias because it occurs for several reasons. So we would like to think the world is an orderly and predictable place and that we are smart enough to predict what will happen. And at times we'll confuse the facts we know now with those we knew earlier. So we focus on the facts we knew earlier that fit with the later outcome, but then we disregard those that didn't fit. Then we'll put together a meaningful story in which the earlier events seem to lead inevitably to the outcome. That's bias, that tendency to be able to mold our recollections of the past to fit how we think it should have turned out. I will be stopping here, and we will hopefully pick up on forgetting, and hopefully we won't forget that we're up to forgetting on Monday. Have a great weekend.